The amount of money being spent on podcast ads is growing with every year. There is an opportunity for podcasters both to earn from their show as well as promote their show. In this episode, we will talk more about how ad pricing works, a few good ad networks, and how you can use podcast ads to promote your show. Welcome to the Podcasting University. Looking for help on starting your own podcast? Then this is the place to be. We will help you with everything from selecting your topic to promoting and monetizing your podcast in the simplest language possible. Listen to other podcasters who've been through the grind and learn from them as we interview them every week. You can find more details on thepodcastinguniversity.com. Hello and welcome to episode 69 of the Podcasting University. This is Dilip, your host, and in this episode, we are going to continue the conversation on podcast ads that we started in the last episode, and we'll be looking at some pricing strategies. Listen to the entire episode and I'll tell you two nifty little tricks to grow your podcast so that you can earn money using sponsored ads on your show. So let's get started. The first thing, how do you price your ads? Now, pricing is something that is very confusing when it comes to podcast advertising. There are different methods of pricing podcast ads, and it also depends upon how popular your podcast is. Now, charges can be based on the popularity of your show and on how many downloads your episode gets in the first 30 days of releasing the episode. But one big challenge in podcasting today is that the stats isn't something that is publicly available for any podcasts. So how do advertisers trust the podcast numbers? Now, this is done by podcast advertising networks. Now, most ads are usually sold through these networks who actually vet the download numbers of the podcasters who are listing their shows on these networks. Now, shows like the Joe Rogan Show and John Lee Dumas's Entrepreneur on Fire are extremely popular show, and nobody needs to show numbers for these kind of shows. Now, these shows earn thousands of dollars from sponsorship due to the sheer listenership that they have. Such shows have the liberty of charging advertisers huge amounts, and advertisers would still be willing to buy ads from them. But for other podcasts that aren't as big as these, the challenge is showing or proving to the advertisers the numbers that they can look at and then pricing the ads based on these numbers. Now, let's talk about pricing podcast ads. Now, podcast ads pricing is usually done in two different methods. The first one is a flat rate price per ad, and the second one is a CPM based price. So, a flat rate pricing is something that isn't common, but some of the newer ad networks are giving that option to podcasters. I spoke about two such ad networks in my last episode. I would recommend that you listen to the last episode. So these two ad networks charge pretty low flat rates for podcast advertising. Now, one of the reasons for this pricing model is that the podcasts on these networks aren't hugely popular podcasts and has an average of about 500 to 1000 listens per episode. Now, that's not a huge number. So these kind of podcasts cannot list their podcasts on the bigger ad networks. So these smaller ad networks help them list their show and help them price it optimally by using the flat rate pricing method. Now, the buyers on these networks are usually other podcasters who are looking at promoting their show. So they are obviously looking for cost-effective ads, and all that they are looking for is some visibility for their show. And these networks help give that visibility to their show. Hence, the flat rate pricing makes sense for these networks and also these podcasts. But the more common pricing method is the CPM based method. Now, CPM stands for cost per mil or cost per thousand impressions. In one of his posts, John Lee Dumas actually mentions the advertising rates, and he says that it is about $18 per thousand listens, which is a CPM, for a 15-second pre-roll or a post-roll ad, and $25 per thousand listens for a 60-second mid-roll ad. Now, that is something that he has been charging for his episodes. Now, considering the popularity of his show and the amount of listens that he might be getting, he might be charging a premium on his show as well, but this is primarily the advertising rates that most podcasters charge. A study by Bolter also showed that most podcasters charge around the rates of between $10 to $40 CPM. In most of these cases, the downloads are actually calculated for the first 30 episodes after the episode is released. So that is something that you might want to keep in mind. Now, what you charge or can charge for your show will entirely depend upon its popularity and also the network that you plan to go with. Like what I said, JLD's podcast, Entrepreneur on Fire, is a hugely popular podcast. So while he might be charging about $18 per 1,000 listens for a 15-second pre-roll ad, he might also be charging a premium to some of the brands or some of the advertisers that are reaching out to him just because his podcast is that popular. We're almost 5 minutes into today's episode, and I'm hoping that you are enjoying the conversation until now. If you are, then please do consider referring this podcast to your friends, your family, and your social media circles. Whoever is interested in getting started a podcast, they'll be able to find a lot of value in this show. So do consider referring the Podcasting University to people who you think will benefit from this information. Now, let's continue with the conversation. Now, while these two are the prominent pricing methods, there is another pricing method as well that a lot of podcasters follow. And that doesn't involve any monetary exchange. Those are paid in kind. And this method is primarily called as ad swaps, or it's a collaboration. Now, ad swap is basically an agreement between two podcasters to feature each other's ad on their show. So there is no money exchange involved. Now, for example, if my podcast gets about 1,000 listens per month and another podcaster who has about 1,000 listens per month reaches out to me and wants to place an ad on my podcast, we can do an ad swap where I place an ad for his podcast on my show and he places an ad for my podcast on his show. That's what ad swaps are all about. Now, ad swaps are usually done between podcasts that have a similar popularity in terms of the download numbers. So somebody who has 1,000 listens per episode and somebody who has 10,000 listens per episode, the ad swaps usually don't work between these two podcasts. The bigger ad networks don't have this option. So you might not be able to find an ad swap with some of the bigger podcast advertising networks. But some of the smaller ad networks, like the ones that I spoke about in the last episode, do provide that option. And if you are somebody who's looking at promoting your podcast, you can look at the ad swap option as well. We'll be talking more about things that you need to keep in mind in my next episode, which will be about promoting your podcast using podcast ads. So don't forget to subscribe and listen to that episode because that will be something that you might be extremely interested in. Now, let us look at some of the things that you might want to keep in mind when you go with podcast advertising. When agreeing to place an ad on your show, there are a couple of things that you might want to keep in mind. And don't forget that your primary objective is to provide value to your audience. While you also want to make money from your podcast, it is important that you take care of your audience's interest as well. So here are a few things that you might want to keep in mind when you're going in with sponsorship or podcast advertisements. Number one, always vet the ad that you're being asked to place on your show. Now, you might not have this option if you're going with a dynamic ad insertion from your host, but still you should ensure that the ads that you or your audience wouldn't like to hear on your show aren't placed on your show, particularly explicit ads. Number two, don't compromise your principles, your podcast quality, and your audience interests just to earn a few bucks. Because sponsorships don't pay you a lot until and unless your podcast is hugely popular and has thousands and millions of downloads. Number three, remember that ads that are more than 15 to 20 seconds in the pre-roll and post-roll don't work well with listeners. So avoid longer ads in your pre-roll and post-roll. Number four, the mid-roll can be a maximum of about 60 seconds. So don't run ads that are longer than that because your listeners will get turned off with longer ads and they might lose interest in your episode. Now, there are a lot of podcast networks that can pay you money for placing ads on your podcast. But there are also some podcast hosts that can help you make money with podcast ads. I've tried 3 different hosts until now for some of the different shows that I host or have run. These are Spreaker, Buzzsprout, and Acast. Now, while Acast is my favorite and Acast is a podcast host where I am hosting my show right now, Buzzsprout is a close second because they are also an amazing podcast host. But Spreaker isn't something that I recommend anyone because I wasn't really happy with the kind of support that I got from Spreaker. Now, the reason I'm talking about these three podcast hosts is because they are the ones who pay podcasters through sponsored ads. There are some of the other podcasts as well, like for example, Libsyn and Podbean. I hear pay podcasters through ads, but since I haven't tried them, I'm not going into these two podcast hosts. Now, Acast, Buzzsprout and Spreaker, all three of them follow the CPM model. So if your show doesn't have a lot of downloads, then the money that you earn could be pretty low, in fact, extremely low. So you might not find a considerable amount of income coming through podcast ads. But it is always a good option when your podcast grows. But if your show has decent downloads and you're looking for a host who can help you earn some money, then these are some of the podcast hosts that I would recommend that you try or move your podcast to. Now, there are some podcast ad networks that can help you make money, but most of these ad networks only work with shows that are big and that have decent downloads. So if your show is big and you have some decent downloads, then you can always look at some of these podcast ad networks who can help you make some good money from your show. Now, some of the prominent ad networks are, number one is AdvertiseCast. They are a huge podcast network and have a nice collection of podcasts. But the only caveat is that you can only work with them if your podcast has a good amount of listens. Number two is Midroll. Now, Midroll has been there for some time and works with podcasts that are both big and small. But again, your podcast needs to have some amount of downloads, good amount of downloads to get listed on Midroll. Podgrid is a network for you if you aren't as big as the Joe Rogans or the JLDs. They work with smaller podcasts as well. But again, that smaller isn't as small as maybe about 100 or 200 listens per episode. Number four is Authentic Shows. Again, Authentic Shows is a network that works with bigger podcasts that have huge downloads. And number five is Megaphone. Now, Megaphone is a podcast advertising network that was acquired by Spotify some time back. And they are a network that allows marketers to buy targeted ads on podcasts based on segmentation. They are available only to networks and podcasts with an average of about 20,000 or more per episode. So if your show doesn't have that amount of downloads, then you might not be able to list your show on Megaphone. So that's some extremely important information on podcast ad pricing and podcast ad networks. Now on to the tricks that I spoke about. Number one, Apple Podcasts and Spotify together account for more than 70% of the total listens in podcasts. So ensure you are promoting these links on your social media instead of adding a ton of links to other networks. I would recommend using one of them primarily and the other one as a secondary link because these two are the ones that are going to give you the maximum number of downloads. So focus on them. Number two, purchase podcast ads for your show on podcasts that are relevant to your show and in your niche. Recommendations are the biggest source of growth for podcasts. And what better way than showing up in front of a podcast listening audience to grow your show? So go ahead and purchase podcast ads on some of the other podcasts and get more listeners for your podcast. I'll be talking more about this strategy in my next episode. So don't forget to tune in the next week and listen to my next episode. And that's all that I have for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the information that I shared in today's episode. If you did, then don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you stay updated whenever I release a new episode. The Podcasting University is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Amazon Prime Music, and pretty much all podcasting platforms. You can pick your favorite podcasting platform and give it a listen in there. Visit thepodcastinguniversity.com for the show notes, the resources that I spoke about in this episode, and the resources that I recommend for podcasting. And don't forget to join the 10-day e-course. It's a free e-course on how to get started with your own podcast. That's all that I have for this episode. I'll be back again the next week with a continuation of our discussion about podcast advertising. But this time it is going to be around how you can promote your podcast using podcast ads. That's all for this week. I'll be back again the next week. You all have a wonderful rest of the day and a good weekend ahead. This is goodbye from Dilip.